This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. So, this episode I have been sitting on it for months. And it's because I really wanted to get this episode right. Not that I'm afraid to get into it, but it's something that I've really wanted to do right, because it's not something that you just kind of skim the surface with. It is a topic that deserves your full attention. So what could we be talking about that deserves this kind of introduction? And of course, we're talking about critical race theory. I think years ago, I did welcome to critical race theory type of episode, but I really wanted to deep dive into it even more, because just with everything that's going on in the world, I think we need to be having these important, and yes, it's going to be hella uncomfortable, but these really important conversations from the correct frame of understanding. And, just in general, I've noticed that, that's the beautiful thing about language. It's always evolving, but it's clear that when we're having these conversations, a lot of this communication comes from just having very different understandings of words or concepts that are just so big. And I hope that this episode is just a one way of correcting that. And so we're really about to get into critical race theory. And I don't know about y'all, but even just hearing those words, you could already be having a response to it. Maybe some of y'all are listening and you're leaned in, you're ready to get into it. Maybe there was a little flicker of, wariness or defensiveness. Maybe some of you are just awash with curiosity and feeling overwhelmed, perhaps don't know where to begin. And you know what? Whatever you're feeling, let's talk about it, because I think the thing with critical race theory is that it's become very politically charged, misused, and it's a misunderstood phrase or concept. And that is why I really want to unpack it, because it's one of those things where the noise around it is so loud, the actual meaning of it is just completely buried in that noise, and we don't get to talk about what it is and what it means. So let me just be very clear, crystal clear about what this episode is about. Again, the co-op of the show is never to tell you this is how you should feel about a topic. I want y'all to have the information to kind of to make your own conclusions, but unpack it in a way that is true and real and not having anything in the blind spot. Well, that's what I try my best to do. So this episode is not an academic lecture. It's not a political rally. I hope, anyways, my hopes is that it's a genuine, curious, layered kōrero around, this framework, which is critical race theory that was developed decades ago. And I think if we really understood what critical race theory is and isn't, it can be a genuinely useful tool for helping us make sense of the world that we're living in now. And with everything that's going on, we need those tools. We needed them yesterday. But we really need those tools. And so, I've been wanting to do this episode for a really long time, just giving it the respect that it deserves. But why now? We're living in a world where governments are rolling back on diversity and equity commitments at a speed which is giving me whiplash. And this is not just happening overseas, it's happening here in Aotearoa. We're living in a world where AI is just taking off, and we're seeing, you know, all the biases that kind of exist in our systems now being baked into AI. You know, there's a lot of debates around migration, and regardless of how you feel about it, it's not just a conversation about migration. If we keep it, you know, 100% real, it's about belonging and fundamentally who counts as a human and who is fully humanized, and then by extension of that, who deserves protection and who gets to belong. And these are not conversations that are just happening, again, overseas. It's happening here. You know, if you think about our communities, Pacifica communities, migrant communities, Asian communities, and not just Tauiwi, we're talking about tangata whenua and our Indigenous communities. They're not just abstract, you know, debates. It's not just theory. It's like, I don't know how else to describe it, but it's like the texture of our real daily lives. And so with all of this happening, you know, I think if we really understood critical race theory, it gives us a language and a lens. And again, I'm not saying it's a perfect one and it's not the only one, but it's an important one. So, you know, today we're really about to get into it about what critical race theory is, where it came from, you know, its core ideas. And you know what? We're about to pick it apart too. You know, we're going to talk about the critiques, but we can also talk about how it can be applied in the world that we're living in now. So, you know, we're about to get theoretical, but we're going to get practical. So I hope you know, enjoy this episode with me. So let's go right to the beginning about where critical race theory comes from, because I think it's really important to understand, you know, where it came from and what it's actually saying. So, you know, let's lay some groundwork, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. Because, yeah, we need to understand its foundational idea. So the foundational idea about critical race theory is that race, it is not biological. And let me say that again. Race, it is not a natural biological category. And for those who are like, really, what am I? You know, there was the Human Genome Project, which I think was finished in like the early 2000s. It had confirmed, you know, what, you know, scientists had known a long time, or argued for a long time, is that there is more genetic variation within, you know, quote unquote racial groups, than between them. And so, you know, this system that had been existing for a long time, this idea that existed for a long time, you know, where humanity is kind of being divided into discrete and defined biological races. They were invented, not scientific, not rooted in science at all. And I know that is like, if this is when I first heard this, and I know it sounds crazy saying this out loud now, but I think I just really like subconsciously absorbed that story. And it wasn't until I really got into critical race theory that I was like, holy heckers, like I didn't realize the roots of the story and how embedded it was into me. I really like, it took me a hot minute to really accept that for me personally. And it's strange because we grew up in a world, whether you realize it or not, we grew up in a world and a society and in a system where race, it feels very real and very, for lack of a better word, consequential, right? Because we live in a world where your race kind of determines what barriers you may or may not have and what privileges you may or may not have. And again, whenever I talk about privilege, I feel like I always need to put that disclaimer out that it doesn't automatically mean life is going to get easier for you and you're never going to have any struggles. And privilege comes in many forms as well. But, you know, that is a fact of our systems that we exist in, that race, has significance. And so, even though race biologically doesn't exist in the real world and in our system, it is real in the sense that it has consequences. And so what critical race theory is telling us is that race is a social construct. And I'm going to repeat that again because it's so important. Race is a social construct, saying that, we created this concept of race and also not just created the concept of it, but gave it meaning and built systems around it. And that is so real. And so the fact that race is a social construct is what makes it so powerful. And because it's a social construct, that makes it even more harder to dismantle. If we think about things that are also social constructs, let's talk about money. Let's talk about, lag, as we say in my culture in Somali. Money is a social construct. Well, if you think about it, paper, coins, material objects. But money shapes everything about how societies function, right? Like people who tend to have a lot of money have more power. If you don't have a lot of money, life is hard. And money is a privilege and power in itself. And so the fact that we as humans invented money doesn't make it any less real in its effect. And I think race is very much the same way. And so if you think about, the racial categories that we navigate today, whether it's Indigenous, Latino, Black, whites, they were constructed over centuries of colonialism, through slavery, through immigration law, through census categories, through scientific racism, through cultural storytelling. And, once these kind of racial categories were built, then the systems that we see now, our institutions, our laws, social norms, really organized around these racial categories. And I think this is the exact architecture that critical race theory wants us to see. And I think another thing that makes critical race theory a bit harder to understand is that it's really framed as an American issue, because race, I think, it hits different in America. Of course, we have things to unpack here in Aotearoa, but it's never really discussed from that lens of talking about it from race. But that is very prominent in America. And yes, of course, you cannot deny where CRT came from, which was American legal academia. And so, a lot of the examples around it come from American history. But that logic there applies everywhere where there are racialized hierarchies. Oh my God, why am I struggling to say that word? Which is most of the world. If you think about here in Aotearoa, we have a really big colonial history, Indigenous disposition, complex migrant communities. All of this is so relevant because, it's a question of who gets to belong, whose history is centered, which bodies are treated as threatening or disposable. And when you think about it like that, those questions are not uniquely American. It very much applies here in Aotearoa. If we think about Te Tiriti o Waitangi, there's a very specific legal and constitutional context there. And if you think about what Māori communities have long navigated, and I say navigating actually because it's very much happening in the present day, it's the exact tension that critical race theory describes, right? There's it's baked into our systems, this inequality that coexists with this power and privilege. And so there is this inequality that has been baked into the system that is persistent, and it shows in so many areas of life. Māori communities are disproportionately affected in health, incarceration rates, educational achievement, housing access. And so I'm not going to sit here and say critical race theory gives us all of the answers in this context, but it does, it is an important tool, and it does give us a language for naming what's happening. And, I think for me, I'll give another example, and this is something that I'm comfortable speaking to because it is a community that I belong to. Me being a Muslim, and a disclaimer, I'm not a perfect Muslim, okay? I'm not here to represent the Muslim community, but as a Muslim, across the world, the category of Muslim has been racialized post 9/11, and it functions socially and in ways that look a lot like race, even though it's a religious identity. And so even being Muslim has been racialized post 9/11. And I think critical race theory is really helpful here too, because it can give us an understanding about how, I don't want to use the word categories, communities are constructed and weaponized in a way that's real and part of our daily texture of life. And so, let's talk about, how and why critical race theory was born, because I think it's really important to understand the genesis of it, because it didn't just appear from thin air. It emerged or came out in the late 70s and 80s, and it was a group of legal scholars who were asking that question that really, and it must have been a really deeply uncomfortable question to even explore or to attempt to answer, which is why, despite all the civil rights victories of the 1950s and 60s, because if you think about that history, there was the big Supreme Court decisions, the formal end of legal segregation. Why were Black Americans still facing such profound and persistent inequality? And so, if you think about it, the Black community had won on paper in black and white legally, yes, but yet it still didn't match the day-to-day reality. And, a lot of it has to do with the fact that, as I was saying before, race is a social construct, and social constructs, if there was a magic answer to kind of solve these things, amen. I think we wouldn't even having conversations like this, but social constructs run way deeper than black and white and legal constructs. But anyways, there was a group of scholars. So shout out to Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, and Mari Matsura, and there were others too, but these are the ones that I was able to find in my research that were named. But the scholars who would go on to form the basis of CRT, they were also working in the space of critical legal studies, which already asked that question of whether law is truly neutral. And so this was kind of an extension of that, but specifically talking about race. And so their big idea was that if the law isn't neutral, if it reflects the interests and assumptions of those who write and interpret it, then a legal system built during and after centuries of explicit racial hierarchy, they're going to encode that hierarchy even after explicit racial language is removed. So that is so powerful. Really just think about that and sit with that, because if you can remove the word colored, which is one of the word and the language that was used a lot back then, if you can remove the word colored from a housing policy and still end up with policies that devastate black neighborhoods through redlining, through urban renewal, through highway construction that completely broke apart and bisected communities. The racial language itself is gone, but that racial impact remains. And so, these scholars really worked at it for years. I think it was like a decade of really sitting with this and unpacking it and interrogating constantly, that they kind of came together with this framework. And so the big argument, or the seed, the essence of this whole thing, is that racism isn't a relic of the past that law has mostly fixed. It's embedded in institutions and systems, and it's reproduced by systems that claim to be neutral. So, it's, when you think about it like that, it's not just about individual prejudice, it's about structure. And so I think the really important thing here is that the law is not neutral. And then, for example, in the 1950s and 60s, returning American veterans were given access to mortgages, college education, and economic mobility on like an unprecedented scale. So it high-key actually created the American middle class as we know it today. But, in practice, Black veterans were very much excluded, whether it was by explicit discrimination or being steered towards segregated institutions and neighborhoods that did not benefit from the same wealth-building mechanisms. And so, the law itself might not have said white veterans only. It said, returning American veterans, but the implementation, the context, and the surrounding web of laws and practices, that kind of created the storm that meant that the racial outcomes were unequal. And so there's this gap between formal equality and lived inequality, and where critical race theory leaves. And this gap has only widened and multiplied, and girl, maybe that gap was a bridge we could have crossed, and now it's like galaxies. We're trying to do some intergalactic travel with how big this gap has become. And so, let's get to the core ideas of what critical race theory is. And I think the first one is that racism isn't rare. It's quite ordinary, actually, the way that it's built into our systems. It's not an exception, that appears when a bad apple acts out of prejudice. It's the norm because it's woven into our institutions. And I know it's really uncomfortable saying that out loud. I'm not out here saying that you as a person are a racist. All I'm saying is that it's so woven into our system and the way that we look at the world. Like, we have to work really hard to work against that. And so it gets really baked into the lens in which we view this world. And I think this is where one point where a lot of miscommunication or misunderstanding happens, and where critical race theory loses a lot of people, because the way that we've been raised to think about racism is that it's very specific and it's a personal way. It's as if this prejudice lives in individual hearts. And so, when critical race theory says that racism is ordinary, I think a conclusion that people land on from that is that then, well, all white people are racist. And that's not what it's saying. What it's saying is that you do not need a racist intent to produce racist outcomes, because we live and exist in systems that can be racially inequitable without anyone in that system consciously being, quote unquote racist. So, for example, let's talk about standardized testing. So for a long time. Standardized tests were used as we're kind of held up to this like neutral, objective, arbiter of academic merit. But study after study has shown that these tests, they reflect cultural knowledge, access to test prep, and socioeconomic background in ways that produce racially stratified results. And so again, the test itself doesn't have a racist intent, but the outcomes are racially unequal. And so what critical race theory asks us to do is to look at the outcome and not just the intent. And I think that is a really important thing to understand, because it's an opportunity for a profound shift, right? Because it's not saying, you're not landing in the conclusion of like, I didn't mean to be racist, or our policy doesn't mention race. It's just like, when you really get into it, it's like not relevant, and it's also not sufficient, because what matters is impact. What actually happens to people in their bodies, in their lives, in their bank accounts. That is what critical race theory asks us to do. I think another thing about critical race theory where it, is uncomfortable and also it loses a lot of people is that, and this part is really centered in America, because again, it was American legal scholars who made this, is that significant racial progress in America has tended to happen not because of some moral awakening among white majorities, but because that progress happened to coincide with the interests of white power structures. And this kind of reminds me of an episode I did a couple of episodes back about, based on Omar's book about, at some point we would be okay with this, and kind of talking about how, we systematically approve of progress when it kind of aligns with the system, or it doesn't feel uncomfortable or controversial anymore. And I think a really good example of demonstrating this is the 1954 Brown and Board of Education decision, which was a decision that desegregated American schools. And there was one particular scholar who really unpacked this idea. His name was Derek Bell. And Bell looked at the context of that decision, and he noted something really important about that time. And it came at the height of the Cold War. And this is when, United States was locked in ideological competition with the Soviet Union for influence in newly decolonizing African and Asian nations. And so the State Department itself was producing memos arguing that American racial segregation was a propaganda gift to communist states, which undermines American credibility as a defender of freedom and democracy, right? So Derek Bell made that argument that that decision didn't happen just because the Supreme Court suddenly kind of grew a conscience. It happened because desegregation served American geopolitical interests at that moment. And so what is this actually saying in the bigger picture? Sorry, I knew that example was it was a meaty example. But this theory predicts that racial progress built on dominant group convenience is fragile. Like when the interests of the ones in power shift, the progress can be rolled back. And let's talk about what's happening recently to really highlight this. If we look in the last 5 years, we had George Floyd's murder in 2020, where we saw the Black Lives Matter movement just it lit up like a flame, and it felt like this flame engulfed the world. There was this extraordinary wave of corporate and institutional commitments to diversity and equity and inclusion. Everyone was releasing statements in 2020. Let me tell you, there was companies and institutions, universities were launching initiatives. I wouldn't even say this was America as well. Like globally, the mood was, the vibes were like very reckoning, like let's challenge the system for what it is. And then the political winds shifted, in America anyway, the Supreme Court rolled back affirmative action. And, by 2020, but just by last year, those same corporations that were releasing statements and posting black squares were quietly on the down low dismantling their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And the language of inclusion, which was being celebrated and proclaimed, it was now being reframed as a threat to neutrality and free speech. And this kind of similar thing is happening here in Aotearoa with the attacks on Titiriti. And so it's really interesting. If Derek Bell, I actually don't know if Homeboy's still alive. I'm not too sure. But anyways, I don't think he would have been surprised. That's what I'm trying to say. And this convergence is it's happening in real time, like racial progress is advancement's convenient, but it's being rolled back when it's costly. And, this could be a reason to crash out or despair, but I think it's a reason to be strategic about where we build, because progress really happens, what I'm trying to say is when progress happens, when it serves the powerful and the privileged, is progress on borrowed time. And there was a third thing that came from CRT, which I think really changed the game, which is intersectionality, people. That is the idea I think that really has changed everything. And one of the ideas from critical race theory that I think has really traveled the most, she has walked into popular culture. And I think also the one, because it's walked the most into the mainstream, gets most simplified. So Kimberlé Crenshaw coined the term in 1989, and it was coined in a paper that examined how black women workers were being failed by both anti-discrimination law and by feminist and civil rights movements that treated gender and race as separate issues. And so her insight was this, that a black woman's experience of discrimination is not just racism plus sexism added together. It is its whole thing. It's a whole distinct experience that exists at the intersection of those identities, and one, in the way that we think about it, anti-racism frameworks focused solely on black men, or feminist frameworks focused primarily on white women, they could not adequately capture that, but intersectionality does. And a good example that she used, which was centered on General Motors, which in the 1970s hired black workers and women workers, but the black workers were in the foundry and the women were in the front office. And so when the layoffs came and seniority rules applied, black women who had only been hired recently and were concentrated in roles that were now being cut were disproportionately affected. And so that specific experience of discrimination was invisible to legal frameworks that only examined race in isolation or gender in isolation. And it's not just a legal framework, right? It goes far beyond that. And it's something that, particularly speaks to me, coming from many communities that are often marginalized in our systems, is that, we are not one-dimensional. We carry multiple identities simultaneously, and those identities interact in ways that create distinct experiences of privilege and oppression. And so we need to embrace intersectionality more. I think we've kind of been thinking about it in a way that's like single issue thinking. And I think intersectionality is the difference between these two questions. And these two questions are, how do we serve our community? And then whose needs in our community are already centered and whose are invincible? And I think another thing about critical race theory is that it really highlights the importance of lived experience. Is that, lived experiences and narratives of people from marginalized communities are legitimate sources of knowledge about how systems operate. It's not an anecdote, it's evidence, baby. I think because institutions love data and statistics, and that is important. Don't get me wrong. Numbers are important, but numbers also feel objective. And numbers can obscure as much as they reveal, right? It's not the full story. Like, for example, if you measure academic achievement by a standardized test, that was designed by and normed on a particular demographic, the numbers will tell you something, but they're not going to tell you the whole story. And the student who scores poorly on that test, they could be fluent in 3 different languages. They could be navigating complex family responsibilities. They could face discrimination. And, that's a story of resilience. And it's also just not the full truth. And it contains truth about, that story contains truth about our education system and just our system in general that the test score cannot capture. And so, I think critical race theory tells us that the experiences of those who are systematically disadvantaged, it is essential information about how the system actually works, as opposed to how it claims to work. And those stories deserve to be heard not as complaints, but as data. And I think this understanding of critical race theory is really important to get into, because as I was saying before, like, we're just living in a turbulent world, right? There seems to be this huge rollback on diversity, equity, and inclusion globally. There is an increase in extreme right-wing. The way that we talk about migration is extremely dehumanizing. It's insane. And so I think critical race theory, if we really understood it for what it is, then we can talk about these conversations in a way that really makes sense and really get to the core of what we're talking about. Just to give an example, because I feel like I haven't spoken about this example a lot in this episode so far, which is environmental racism and the intersection of critical race theory with climate justice. And there's this institution in America, the Brookings Institution, and they do policy research, and they published work which explicitly connects critical race theory frameworks to environmental justice, arguing that banning critical race theory informed analysis will actually undermine our ability to address climate inequity. And, it's not an accident that polluting facilities, oil refineries, chemical plants, waste dumps tend to be located near low-income communities and communities of color, and countries as well that are kind of seen as third world compared to the Western world. And it's not an accident that Indigenous communities globally are disproportionately affected by the, extraction industries operating on or near their lands. And it's also not an accident that as climate change intensifies, its worst immediate impacts, flooding, heat stress, loss of land that we can live on, it falls heaviest on the global south, on Pacific Island communities, and communities with the least economic cushion. And, these are outcomes that are specific decisions made by specific institutions in a world structured by racial hierarchy. And, critical race theory gives us a framework for naming that, and it gives us a way of thinking about it so we can say, the question of who bears the costs of fossil fuel economies and who gets to extract the benefits is fundamentally a question about race and power. And so you cannot develop adequate climate policy without that analysis. And, it's really real. There are, especially in the Pacific, there are entire island nations that face literal submersion. I think that's already happening to some islands. This is not an abstract theoretical thing. It is happening right now. And so, these are the communities that have kind of contributed least to carbon emissions that have caused this climate change to begin with, are bearing the greatest cost. And that is on structural racism operating on a global level. And so, there are so many things that we need to talk about when it comes to critical race theory, because it's applicable to everything. Especially with the rise of AI, those same biases are kind of baked into our system. There was a study done not too long ago in 2024 that found that AI medical models were reproducing false biological beliefs about race in their pain assessments. And so in this AI, it was encoded this myth that Black patients have higher pain tolerance, which has led to Black patients receiving less pain medication. And it's not just a theoretical thing. Like, this impacts people's lives, to make this even more real. There's a PhD student in America named Jasmine Evans who experienced a 4-year delay, 4 years in receiving a kidney transplant because a racially biased algorithm in medical risk calculations put her on the wait list far later than her actual medical need warranted. Which is insane. Another example, AI systems used to schedule medical appointments these AI systems have predicted that Black patients are at higher risk of no-shows, which is technically an accurate prediction based on historical data, but a prediction that kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because Black patients get worse appointment slots, which means more missed appointments, which reinforces this prediction. And so the cycle just keeps feeding itself. And so, critical race theory, it really does apply to a lot. And I think if we really understood what it was saying, we would be asking different questions and therefore would be having different conversations. But I'm also not here to say that it is, it is the end all be all. It's not the only tool that I think we should have in our toolkit. And I think one of the biggest critiques has made, there's an argument there, and this was put forward by Adolph Reed Jr., a political scientist, that critical race theory and any other related race-centered frameworks can become a form of what he coined as race reductionism, which is treating race as the primary or sufficient explanation for inequality in ways that kind of can obscure the role of class and economic structure. And so I think Reed's argument here is not to say that racism doesn't exist. It's that separating racial inequality from economic exploitation kind of can distort that picture. And he kind of pointed to the history of the civil rights through the 1930s and 40s, which, mainstream civil rights leaders argued that racial equality required both anti-discrimination policies and economic transformation, better wages, labor rights, social democracy. And the Cold War really suppressed the class part of that argument. And so it just kind of left the civil rights corridor focused on identity and representation, but it really disconnected from that economic structures that produced Black poverty. And so I think this critique really hits when we look at what diversity has looked like in practice, which is a more diverse ruling class, while working class people of all races continue to be economically squeezed. And so, again, representation matters, but representation of who and doing what? Having a Black CEO at a corporation that exploits low-wage workers of color does not dismantle structural racism in any meaningful way. And, having a Muslim politician who votes for drone strikes on Muslim-majority countries is not justice as well. And so there's this argument there that critical race theories focus on racial identity, if it's taken too far, can miss the economic structures and architecture there. And I think that the antidote or the solution to that comes from within critical race theory, which is intersectionality itself. And so, yes, we need to think about race and class and gender. But we also need to keep that in mind that, when we are talking about racial representation, it's not a substitute for economic redistribution, right? And so we risk building a more diverse hierarchy rather than more than just one. There's also this other critique on critical race theory about the lived experience as a legitimate knowledge. And, there's criticism from actually all sorts of researchers and scientists from different spaces who worry about what happens when we elevate the personal narrative as evidence without subjecting it to rigorous scrutiny. And I think, the concern is if we say that personal experience cannot be challenged or questioned because to do so is itself an act of oppression, we've made a certain type of claim immune to interrogation. And that's kind of problematic because, not every personal account is accurate, right? Memory is fallible, and personal experience, while it is very valuable, it can also reflect that individual psychology, misperception or confirmation bias. Really, that story, what it's saying is that lived experience or that storytelling is filtered through that person's lens in which they view this world, right? We're not looking at these stories with the same lens. And that is a genuine tension, right? And so, but I think critical race theory, this is where we have to be, careful with how we handle it, because, the argument was never that personal narratives are infallible or beyond scrutiny. It's just that instead of it being an anecdote, it is one evidence. It's a type of evidence that's particularly valuable for understanding the lived impact of structural processes, that have been historically dismissed or marginalized in favor of objective data. So I think, I'm not saying I have the solution here. I think this critique is worth sitting with. Maybe the corrective solution here is to take stories seriously and maybe not to declare them as sacred, but building a politics of knowledge around identity can, sometimes reproduce, right? Spaces where certain experiences are centered to the exclusion of others, where critical engagement is kind of seen as hostility, complexity can be flattened. And I don't think that's the intention of critical race theory, but I think, it is a critique we're sitting with because it's a real risk in how these frameworks are applied in practice. And you know what? I think I've just gone ahead and been too ambitious with critical race theory. I fear I'm going to have to do a part 2 because I really want to get into the practical nature of this and how all of this good theory can be applied in our world today and how it can be used as a tool. But I hope that this episode anyway has really told you what critical race theory is and what it isn't, because I think it really gets misused, and it's not what most people are kind of talking about what it is. Like, there's a lot of noise around it. I think we can cut that noise. And critical race theory is not here to make white people feel guilty. It's not reverse discrimination. It's kind of been weaponized in this cultural war that we're living in. So what is critical race theory? It is a set of tools for understanding how race, law, and power have interacted historically and continue to interact today. It tells us that racism is not mainly about individual prejudice. It's about structural architecture and arrangements. And it tells us that, just because there may be equality in black and white, it does not automatically produce, equality in our day-to-day lives, because race is a social construct, and that is way harder to dismantle. It tells us that progress towards racial justice is real, but it's also fragile because it's often hinged on the interests of those with power. Critical race tells us that our identities are complex and intersecting. They are not one-dimensional, and they cannot be isolated. It also tells us that the stories of marginalized people, they contain essential knowledge, not just anecdotes, essential knowledge about how our systems work. So, these are not just radical ideas in the sense of being disconnected from reality. They are ideas that emerge from careful attention to evidence, like to history, to data, to the lived experiences of people in communities who navigate this world. And so, does this idea have limits? Hell yes. Is critical race theory the only framework that we need? Oh, heck no. Does it sometimes get applied in reductive and unhelpful ways? Absolutely. But the core of it, the insistence on clearly seeing how race and power operate, is really liberating and important. And so thank you for tuning into this episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. We will most definitely be getting more into this in the next episode. So stay tuned for part 2. Take care. Ka kite.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.